China, 1900. In a city called Baoding, a missionary compound stands surrounded. Outside its walls, the sound of a crowd that has come not to listen, but to end something. Inside, a Canadian woman named Susannah Lowe sits on the floor of a small room with her 2 daughters pressed against her sides. The youngest not yet 4 years old, and she is not praying for rescue. She gave up praying for rescue 3 days ago. She is praying for something harder. Lord, let us meet this without shame. That is where this story begins. Not with her conversion, not with her calling, not with the day she sailed from Halifax in 1891, with a single trunk and a letter of appointment from the China Inland Mission. It begins here, in this room, in this city, in this summer. Because this is the moment that reveals what everything before it was building toward. But to understand what she did in that room, you have to go back to the beginning. Susannah Eleanor Lowe was born in 1866 in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, the 3rd daughter of a Presbyterian minister who read scripture at breakfast and believed, without sentimentality, that God governed the affairs of nations. She grew up in a house where faith was not decoration. It was structure. It held the walls up. Her father prayed over his congregation's troubles the way a physician diagnoses illness, with precision, without panic, because he believed the remedy was real. She watched him do this her whole childhood and absorbed it the way children absorb weather. Not consciously, not as doctrine, simply as the texture of the world she lived in. She was not the most remarkable student at the Pictou Academy. She was not the prettiest girl in the county, or the one the young men from the fishing boats looked at first. She was quiet in the way that certain people are quiet not from shyness but from listening. She read everything she could get her hands on. Medical textbooks borrowed from the doctor 2 streets over. Letters from the regions beyond Missionary Union, published in the monthly church bulletin. Accounts of Hudson Taylor's work in inland China that she copied in her own handwriting into a journal she kept under her bed. Her mother died when Susannah was 17. Typhoid in January, quick and merciless, the way typhoid takes people who have lived carefully all their lives. The anchor was gone. The older sisters married within 2 years. Her father buried himself in his parish, and Susannah sat alone in the kitchen of that Presbyterian manse for the better part of a year, reading those missionary accounts and feeling something she could not name grow larger in her chest, until it had no more room to grow and had to become a decision. She told her father at supper one evening in 1888. She was going to apply to the China Inland Mission for appointment as an unattached female missionary. She did not ask his permission. She told him because she loved him, and because he deserved to hear it from her, and not from the women in the church. Her father set down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I have been expecting this conversation." He did not say he was glad. He did not say he was afraid. He said, "You will need Mandarin. Begin studying now." And that was that. She sailed in the spring of 1891, 25 years old, 1 trunk, the letter of appointment, and a Mandarin grammar she had been working through for 2 years and still found impenetrable. Halifax Harbor dissolved behind the ship, and she stood at the stern and watched it go and felt something that she later described in a letter to her father not as peace but as clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you have made a decision so large. There is nothing left to decide. The language broke slowly, then all at once. She arrived in Shanghai in the summer and was sent almost immediately to language school in Guangzhou, where she lived with 2 other women missionaries and a Chinese tutor named Mr. Chen, who was patient with her vowels and baffled by her consonants. By Christmas she could ask for directions. By the following spring she could conduct a conversation. By 1893, when she was posted to Baoding in Hebei province, she could preach. Not fluently, not without errors, but she could stand in front of a room of people and speak the gospel in their language, which was the only thing that mattered. Baoding in 1893 was not a city that welcomed her. The foreign presence in inland China in those years existed in a state of permanent friction with the surrounding culture, and Susannah felt that friction every day. When she walked the streets, children followed her calling out the word for foreign devil. When she opened the small clinic she ran out of the mission compound, women sometimes came and sometimes did not. When she preached in the little chapel the mission had built, the congregation was never larger than a dozen people. and half of them were the children of the Chinese Christians who worked at the compound. She did not experience these years as failure. She experienced them as instruction. Every day she was being taught something. About the language, about the culture, about the difference between what she had believed Christianity looked like from Pictou County and what it actually looked like when you were trying to explain the incarnation to a woman who had never heard the name of Christ. She wrote to her father every week. He wrote back. Those letters were her lifeline and her correction. He reminded her in one of them, in his precise, unsentimental way, that Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before his assignment began. She read that letter 3 times. In 1895, she met Thomas Aldworth. He was a British missionary, tall, with a Yorkshire accent, and a way of moving through difficult situations that suggested he had never once considered that things might not work out. He had been in China since 1888. He spoke Mandarin the way Susannah could only aspire to, fluid and natural, with the specific tones of Hebei province that foreigners almost never got right. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. He had a wide face and large hands, and the kind of steadiness that becomes attractive only after you have spent some time with it. They were married in 1897 in the compound chapel in Baoding, a small ceremony, 2 other missionaries as witnesses. Mr. Chen played a hymn on the harmonium. Her father sent a letter that arrived 6 weeks later with a pressed wildflower from the field behind the manse, which was the most sentimental thing he had ever done. Their daughter Eleanor was born in 1898. Their daughter Ruth was born in 1899. By the spring of 1900, they had been in Baoding for 7 years between them, and had seen perhaps 200 people come through the clinic doors, and perhaps 30 make a genuine profession of faith, and perhaps 12 who had remained, who had weathered the social pressure of conversion in that city, and kept coming to the chapel on Sunday mornings and bringing their children. 12 people. It was not a number that looked like success from the outside. From the inside it looked like 12 small fires in a very dark place. Then the summer of 1900 arrived. The Boxer uprising had been building up for months. Reports from other provinces had been reaching the mission compound since spring. Villages where foreign missionaries had been killed, churches burned, Chinese Christians hunted through the streets for the crime of their faith. The senior missionaries at the compound debated departure. Thomas was certain they should stay. He believed the Christians in their small congregation had no protection without the mission's presence. To leave was to abandon them. Susannah agreed. They stayed. The compound came under threat in the last week of June. The gates were barricaded. The Chinese Christians gathered inside. The 12 and their families, and perhaps 20 others who had come to the walls when the trouble in the streets began. Thomas organized the men to reinforce the gates. Susannah ran the clinic, which was suddenly full, because the violence outside was producing wounds that needed attending to regardless of who was winning. On the 3rd day, the gates broke. The crowd that entered was not primarily soldiers. It was people from the city, ordinary people who had been told a story about what foreigners and their converts had done to China, and had believed it, and had arrived at a place of sufficient fury that they were past the point where individual faces could stop them. Thomas was killed within the first hour. Susannah did not see it happen. She heard it. She was in the back room with Eleanor and Ruth, and 4 of the Chinese women from the congregation, when she heard the shots from the compound yard, and she understood immediately what they meant. And she pressed her daughters' faces against her sides, so they would not see her face in that moment. She sat on the floor of that room for the rest of that day and into the evening. The women from the congregation sat with her. They did not speak much. There was not much to say. They prayed, not for rescue. Rescue seemed very far away, but for the thing that Thomas had always said was the only prayer that never returned empty. Lord, give us what we need for what we are about to face. Give us enough. Not more than enough. Just enough. 2 days passed. The crowd outside the room's single door came and went, but did not break through. Susannah fed her daughters the last of the rice they had brought with them. She told them stories. Stories from the Bible. Stories from Pictou County. Stories about their grandfather's manse and the wildflower field behind it. Eleanor, who was 2, fell asleep in her mother's lap. Ruth, who was not yet 1, was sick with a fever that had started on the second day and was not improving. On the third day, the door opened. Not violently, not with a crowd behind it. It opened quietly, and in the doorway stood a man Susannah had never seen before, a Chinese man in his middle years, and behind him, visible past his shoulder, not a crowd but a single soldier. The man spoke in Mandarin. He said he was a local official. He said there was a way out of the compound through a gate at the rear. He said he would take the women and children through it if they came now, quietly, without any possessions, without drawing attention. He said he had no obligation to do this, and was doing it because his conscience required it. Susannah looked at the women from the congregation. She looked at her daughters. She looked at the man in the doorway, whose face she could not read, and whose motives she could not verify, and in whom she had no choice but to trust. She stood up. She picked up Ruth. She held out her hand to Eleanor. She walked through the door. They moved through the back of the compound in a silence that felt physical, solid, something you could press against. The soldier ahead of them, the official behind, the women from the congregation between. Through the rear gate, into a lane, through the lane to a courtyard. Through the courtyard to a house where they waited for 3 more hours while the sounds of the city settled around them. Then through the city by night, on foot, out to the road that led toward Tianjin and the coast. Susannah walked for 11 days. She carried Ruth for most of them. Eleanor walked beside her, holding the hem of her coat, not complaining in a way that was so extraordinary for a 2-year-old that Susannah would mention it in every account she ever gave of those days. This small child walking through a broken country in the middle of summer without once asking to be carried. 11 days, 170 miles. She arrived at Tianjin on a Saturday morning with bleeding feet and a daughter whose fever had finally broken the night before, and she sat down on the ground at the edge of the relief station and could not stand up again for 2 hours. She went back to Canada. There was no question of staying. Not then. Not with 2 small children and no husband, and a China that was coming apart. She arrived in Halifax in September 1900 and took the train to Pictou County and walked up the path to her father's manse and knocked on the door, and her father opened it and looked at her for a long moment and then held out his arms, and she walked into them and stood there, and neither of them said anything. She spent the winter in Pictou County. She healed. She grieved. She let her father's congregation take care of her daughters while she slept the kind of sleep that comes after the body has pushed itself past every reserve it possesses. She received letters from the China Inland Mission, letters from other missionaries who had survived, letters from the families of those who had not. She wrote back to all of them. In the spring of 1901, she began to speak publicly, not about her suffering, not in the way that solicits sympathy or hardens into grievance. She spoke about China, about the 12 people in the Baoding congregation, about what she had watched happen in that city when ordinary people had been given a story to believe about strangers and had believed it, and about what the only answer to that kind of story was. She spoke in churches in Pictou County, and then in Truro, and then in Halifax. She spoke clearly, and without drama, in the way her father preached, as if the facts were sufficient and did not need decoration. People listened, not because she had suffered, though she had, but because she spoke of China as a place she knew and loved, as a place with a literature and a philosophy and a history of its own, as a place that was not a mission field but a civilization, and as a place to which she had made a commitment that had not ended because its cost had turned out to be higher than she had anticipated. She was not asking for pity. She was asking for partners. She returned to China in 1903. Her father kept Eleanor and Ruth in Pictou County. This was the hardest decision she ever made, and she made it in 3 days of prayer that left her so hollowed out she could barely speak. She had weighed it from every angle. She had asked herself the question Thomas used to ask when any decision was unclear. What does love require? Not what is safe. Not what is comfortable, not what people will understand. What does love require? She went back. The Baoding she returned to was quieter, not healed. A city does not heal from what Baoding had been through in a season, but quieter. The mission compound had been rebuilt with funds sent from Canada and Britain. The chapel was standing again, and the 12, not all of them, 2 had been killed in the summer of 1900, and 1 had moved away, But 9 of them were still there. 9, after everything, they were still there. She worked in Baoding for the next 14 years. She ran the clinic. She trained a small number of Chinese women in basic nursing and midwifery. She preached. She translated a collection of hymns from English into the specific dialect of Central Hebei, because the translations in circulation had been done by people who had not grown up speaking the language and the tones were wrong. And wrong tones in a tonal language do not produce inaccurate meaning. They produce nonsense or obscenity. And Susannah had heard enough Mandarin-speaking Christians singing accidentally offensive hymns that she considered accurate translation a form of basic respect. The congregation grew, slowly the way things grow in difficult soil. Not in bursts, but steadily, incrementally, quietly. By 1910, there were 40 people in the Baoding chapel on Sunday mornings. By 1914, there were 80. These were not conversions managed by Susannah. She was not the kind of missionary who kept tallies. They were the result of the 9 who had stayed, who had told their families and their neighbors what they had found, who had become the actual missionary force in that city, while Susannah ran the clinic and trained the nurses and fixed the bad hymn translations. She received a letter in 1912 from a woman in Guangzhou she had never met, a woman named Bright Cloud, who had come to faith through a pamphlet printed by the Baoding congregation that had made its way south through some chain of hands Susannah could not reconstruct. Bright Cloud wrote to say that she had started a small prayer group in her neighborhood. 12 women. They met on Tuesday evenings. They were working through the Gospel of Mark. She wanted to know if Susannah had any suggestions for what to read next. Susannah held that letter for a long time. Then she wrote back. She wrote back and she told Bright Cloud about Luke. She told her about the questions to ask while reading it. She told her about her father and about the wildflower field behind the manse and about the way her father had said that evening at supper in 1888 that he had been expecting the conversation. She told her that the work she was doing in that Tuesday evening prayer group was the same work Susannah was doing in Baoding, which was the same work someone had done in Pictou County, which was the same work that had been passed from hand to hand across 2,000 years, and that the chain did not break because the links were ordinary. It continued because ordinary people had decided, each in their own time, that it was the thing most worth doing. She went home to Canada in 1917. The war in Europe had made everything difficult, and she was not well, a persistent fever that the doctors in Baoding could not diagnose, and that had been quietly reducing her capacities for 2 years. She arrived in Halifax in the autumn, thinner than she had left, and took the train to Pictou County, and her daughters, who were now 19 and 18 and young women of considerable independence and intelligence, met her at the station and walked her back to her father's manse. Eleanor had become a nurse. Ruth was studying at Dalhousie. Her father was 81 and still preaching on Sunday mornings, slowly, carefully, from notes he could barely read but had memorized anyway. He lived for 18 more months after she came home. She sat with him for most of them. He died in the spring of 1919. She buried him in the churchyard behind the manse, in the ground of the county he had served for 50 years, within sight of the wildflower field. She stood at the graveside in the cold April light and felt, as she had felt standing at the stern of the ship in Halifax Harbor in 1891, not grief. Grief would come, but clarity. The thing that had been passed to her was now fully hers to carry. She was 53 years old. The fever had cleared. She had energy she had not expected. She never went back to China. She stayed in Pictou County, and she spoke. For the next 17 years, she spoke in churches across Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, and Ontario. She spoke to missionary societies and to women's guilds, and to church basement gatherings of 12 people who sat in folding chairs and listened to a woman in her 60s describe, without melodrama, what the inland provinces of China looked like when you had lived there for 22 years. She raised money. She corresponded with missionaries. She trained young women who were preparing to go, sitting with them at her kitchen table, and going through their Mandarin grammars and telling them what the language school in Guangzhou would and would not prepare them for. She died in 1936. Pictou County, 70 years old. In her father's manse, in the room she had grown up in, with Eleanor beside her, and Ruth coming in on the train from Halifax. She had never been famous. The China Inland Mission published a brief memorial in their quarterly bulletin. A few newspapers in the Maritimes carried small notices. No biography was written. No church was named after her. The congregation she had tended in Baoding had, by 1936, grown to several hundred people, but she had not known that. She had stopped receiving regular correspondence from China in 1930, as conditions there became too unstable for reliable mail. What she left behind was not visible in the way that monuments are visible. It was visible the way roots are visible, only when something grown from them is disturbed, and you see, under the surface, how deep and how wide the system had run. The Tuesday evening prayer group that Bright Cloud started in Guangzhou in 1912 continued after Bright Cloud's death. It became a church. That church, through the decades of revolution and disruption that followed, maintained its practice of reading through the Gospel of Mark, with new members, which was how Bright Cloud had done it, which was how Susannah had suggested it, which was how Susannah's father had done it in Pictou County, with the young people in his congregation in the 1880s. A chain is as strong as any of its links, and a chain that holds is not usually the product of extraordinary links. It is the product of ordinary ones that did not break when they were tested. Susannah Eleanor Lowe, daughter of a Presbyterian minister from Nova Scotia, wife of Thomas Aldworth, mother of Eleanor and Ruth, missionary of the China Inland Mission, nurse, translator of 17 hymns, correspondent of a woman in Guangzhou she never met in person, was an ordinary link. She did not break. You may not remember her name, but the chain she held is still holding.